But I think all past cultures that have persisted on the planet have grown out of that relationship to nature. And that includes a relationship to nature as kin, as family, or a large extended family. So those rediscovery of those things and finding new stories to convey those are important.
Welcome to the Passing Through podcast, a show dedicated to exploring those spaces not just within, but also between and around us. The cracks in the walls, the moments between the moments. I speak with thinkers, authors, artists, teachers, and everyday humans who have touched the edge of the ordinary and found something to bring back. Hello, hello, hello. I was honored to sit down with this week's guest. He is one of the leading voices in ecological wisdom and regenerative culture. I'm speaking about none other than David Holmgren. He's best known as the co-originator of permaculture. Many listeners will be familiar with permaculture, but if you aren't, we can describe permaculture as a design philosophy that has blossomed into a global movement, offering practical possibilities for living in right relationship to the earth. In 1978, David and Bill Mollison published Permaculture 1, starting the global permaculture movement. Alongside Bill, David helped seed a vision that reimagines agriculture, community, and even economics, not as separate domains, but as interwoven threads in a complex web of existence which makes up the modern world. Over the decades, David has deepened and expanded the permaculture lens, authoring works like Permaculture, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, and RetroSuburbia, which invite us not only to survive the converging crises of our time, climate change, energy descent, social unraveling, but to thrive by reinhabiting our environment with creativity, care, and resilience. David is a deep systems thinker, a grounded realist, and a cultural edge dweller, someone who challenges dominant narratives while offering hopeful alternatives rooted in patterns of nature. In our talk, we cover what role permaculture plays in the polycrisis, nature as family, permaculture as political act, the tension between small-scale local solutions and large-scale global problems, anarchy and authoritarianism, the dark side of permaculture, and more. To learn more about David, you can check out his film, Reading Landscape with David Holmgren, at readinglandscape.org, and also his website at holmgren.com.au for articles, videos, courses, and other resources on permaculture. As always, be good to one another, and let's jump in. Okay. David Holmgren, welcome to the Passing Through podcast.
Good to be talking to you, Danny.
So I want to start us off and root down a little bit with a premise. As a global people, we're facing an initiation in the form of a cascade of crises. An ecological crisis, a climatic crisis, an energy crisis, ballooning social, political, and spiritual crises. And I wonder if we could trace the genesis of each of these crises to a central crisis. And I would suspect that that might be called a narrative crisis, which claims that we're all disconnected, hyper-individualized beings separate from nature. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think when we look back at the origins of the crisis in its many forms, from an ecological perspective, the shift from an agricultural to an industrial base, a shift from dependence on renewable energies to fossil and therefore depleting non-renewable energies, is a step change that permaculture, the conception of permaculture was really based on that huge step change starting about 250 years ago in Europe, and especially in the English speaking world of the then British Isles. But that itself, we can step forward a long way and see the development of individualism rather than collective identity was a natural outcome of having surplus energy. So as people became less dependent on each other and less dependent on their immediate geographic community, as they became more dependent on this non-living, increasingly abstract technospheric bubble, then people could more and more see themselves as individuals separate from everything else. So in some ways you could see that development of that story of us all being separate is partly an outcome of the energetic density and organization shedding our previous collective dependencies in community and kin and with others. But all of these sort of evolutionary steps in human development, whether they're seen as something which is a step change, which is permanent, or whether they're part of pulsing cycles like the development of city-centric civilizations in the pre-fossil fuel era over the last 10,000 years, those have largely been, apart from a few exceptions, blips of growth and then followed by decline and collapse. So things are more cyclical, that they go through these patterns. So I suppose I have that big, energetic, ecological view of human circumstance as being a foundation for permaculture and a way of understanding the world. So part of that suggests, look, human society and ways of thinking are an outcome of energetic, climatic, ecological realities. And that's a minority view, not just in current society, but perhaps even in earlier societies. But it's also a view that comes strongly with people who are connected to our sources of sustenance, people who live in rural environments, who work with the land, who understand where life comes from. But in urban mentality, more disconnected from those fundamentals, there tends to be the opposite view that the world is a construct that follows from our ideas. Like what we think actually sort of creates the world. And I wouldn't want to dismiss that, both from my Jewish ancestry of being, some of my forebears being people of the book, and this incredible belief in the power of words, the power of thoughts in creating things, and the way cultures think about things ends up shaping how they react to their physical environment and circumstances. Perhaps in that, amongst all of my influences in that sort of hard, energetic, ecological thinking, of which there are many, um, for permaculture, I would think of current thinkers like Jeremy Lent in his book, The Patterning Instinct, as someone of that other side. The way we think about things and the way we manifest our stories actually sort of creates culture and creates the world. So I think it's a balance, always between those two things.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good answer. I'm a big fan of Jeremy Lent myself, so I'm
Right.
happy you brought him up. I think he's excellent. And I think the point that you're making here is interesting as well. It's we kind of find ourselves in this like chicken or the egg situation where it's
Mm.
like was it the thinking that allowed us to exploit this ecological energy, or was it the ecological energy that kind of made it possible for us to exploit it?
Hmm. Sometimes in tracing that, forebears to the industrial explosion just didn't come out of nowhere, and clearly there's people who've traced the cultural aspects of Protestant work ethic and ideas that led to the emergence of capitalism. But sometimes what those people don't see is Europe was actually at an ecological breaking point at 1500, and their pathetic little wooden ships, as a result of a chance political circumstance, managed to get to the Americas, where ecological historians now believe 90% of the population of those two great continents died more or less in the period following contact from introduced diseases, which left two continents of free resources, including some of the world's best cultivated plants, as well as a whole lot of already available gold and silver, to take back to Europe and restart what was really Europe was in a process of ecological collapse in 1500. And that was like this huge boost stepping stone of real resource value that allowed Europe to develop the organizational complexity through capitalism and other mechanisms to then tap the big one, which was right under their feet in the form of coal initially. So there is, that larger ecological explanation that explains how that emergence of capitalism and the organizational complexity and banking and all those things that made that possible. So I am a strong advocate of those things, because in our society, people are so unaware of how nature, climate, environment shapes us.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for that context. I like the imagery there too of imagining European civilization at that time as kind of like a business going on bust, and then they find a giant pot of gold and they go, "Oh, we're back." It's interesting. But I guess I wonder, a related question I have is, if we do agree on the fact that we are facing polycrisis, some people call it, just this series of interconnected crises, what role could permaculture play in addressing the individual crises, or maybe a more root aspect of these crises?
Well, I think sometimes when I've been asked to explain permaculture to grounded, older, rural people, sometimes they might say, "Oh, isn't all that just common sense?" And my answer has generally been, well, to a significant extent, that's true, but it's no longer common. So it needs to be rediscovered. So part of
Mm,
culture is simply rediscovering what our ancestors knew and did and ways of thinking, and sometimes just asking our grandparents. Sometimes that ordinary and simple. So in that sense, there's an element of permaculture being a sort of a remedial holistics for over-educated, over-urbanized people disconnected from their sources of sustenance. It's also more than that, in first thinking about those lineages of asking one's grandparents or forebears, or being able to reach back into a particular lineage of a particular culture adapted to a particular place. There's the recognition that that lineage may be broken in many ways and lost, and it may be now dysfunctional because it's disconnected from its place of origins, and the world has changed in so many ways. And not just in things that might be superficial, but things that are sort of like relatively permanent changes. So that means it's necessary in a sense of modern design thinking, where one thinks about what is the nature of what we are looking at. We have to look for new parts of the puzzle and graft them together with pieces of tradition that we inherit or rediscover. So in that sense, the creation of permaculture is part of a creation of new cultures that will again be grounded in place in the future. And in that sense, they will all be different in different places, but that will require this cross fertilization in the same way we can think of migrant plants and animals, migrant cultures of people forming new formations. And perhaps the third element is literally the modern design thinking that's come from now centuries of continuous rapid change, where we have to actually look at completely novel elements in the way appropriate designs might emerge more rapidly than through the very slow processes of trial and error and the development of a tradition or a development of a different way. So, permaculture has always been part of a reaching back into the past or reaching back into the ordinary or the ignored, and also looking at, the novel opportunities.
In that answer, I heard something about culture. And when I think about permaculture, often I hear people emphasize the land aspect of permaculture.
Mm.
But what does a permacultural human look like in their relationships and their stories and their ways of being? Do you have any insights into that? Because that's a topic that interests me a lot lately.
Mm.
Like, how do we use permaculture to kind of restory, redevelop relationships with each other, with the more than human world, and not just think of like, okay, I need to have some vermicompost. I need a chicken tractor. I need to have some swales. Like what are the
Yeah.
other dimensions that people can think about?
Well, yes, there's those dimensions, but there's also the way we look at these things too as items or artifacts, and whether it's a chicken tractor or a swale, or whether it's looking at uh, Thai food um, or some artifact of cultural being that we say, oh yeah, let's grab that and let's throw that together with that. I mean, both those approaches, whether in the cultural domain or if we like in the agricultural domain, don't think that lead to evolve, grounded, enduring design or what we can call culture. So I think that raises that issue of design process is a tricky and difficult subject. And I think even in the context of land design, it's very tricky because most people mostly relate to just copying what is already proven or works, and they relate to the concrete, the 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 things that they can see in front of them. And both in the practice of working the land to provide our basic material needs, and in more abstract cultural domains, these things can become locked in some sort of ossified thing which is no longer responding to the context. And we can see how the cultural aspects can shift much faster because they're fluid and virtual. Whereas when we're dealing with our material bodies and their constant needs, a constant reality of breath and water, and if not environmental comfort, environmental survival in the weather, whatever those forces are. And of course, the big one of food. These things are subject to the laws of physics and the laws of ecology. They can't just be plastic morphed infinitely the way our thinking and our maybe even our human behavior can. But I think all past cultures that have persisted on the planet have grown out of that relationship to nature. And that includes a relationship to nature as kin, as family, or a large extended family. So those rediscovery of those things and finding new stories to convey those are important. But I think it's hard to do that in isolation from the constant grounding with the practical, especially in the modern world, because we come from this lineage of extreme disconnection and alienation. And we could say that varies depending on the person. Some people are, very kinesthetic and just learn by doing and need something concrete to create and see some physical outcome. And other people, some of us, our heads drift away into the clouds. So, and I would put myself in that category, but the discipline of a life lived growing food, if not as a professional, then growing food for self and family for virtually all my adult life, building things, a life in the weather. That those are the constant groundings, which is emblematic of what is needed in our culture of to sort of get regrounded to those things. So, of course, when we look at it in terms of the polycrisis, those things are just enlightened self-interest for being more resilient as all of those support things around us potentially break down or become behind gateways that we can't access without us climbing into tighter and tighter straitjackets. So whether we look at these things as some large design of a future culture, or whether we bring it back to a practical, sensible hedging about the changes in the world around us, different people will be drawn by different aspects of that.
This triggers another question that I was thinking, or something I was chewing on, which was how do we navigate this tension between kind of local, small scale autonomy of people to figure out their own ways of doing things, and we pit that against the global crises that we face, the climate, biodiversity loss, energy crises, which seem to demand large scale coordination. How do we fit these things together? Because sometimes I have difficulty because I seem to believe both simultaneously.
Mm. Yeah, this is a tension that is built into permaculture and more generally environmental thinking. And perhaps within that simple slogan, think globally, act locally, is more than just the sort of superficial understanding of that slogan. It is actually a deep structural tension that is reflected in the permaculture principle, small and slow solutions, which is a direct challenge to the mentality that's emerged in the era of fossil fuel, where we take for granted that the biggest, fastest thing, that those are not just most powerful, but are absolutely necessary. And in our experience, that's what reshapes the world. And that, if you're not working at that scale, then things are not relevant. I think there's a number of ways in which we have to navigate that tension between those realities of large forces around us that are operating at the global scale, but also to discover the deeper truths in the world which emerges naturally, whether we like it or not, from a decline in energy availability and density, is that things just naturally become relocalized, not necessarily in benign utopian ways at all, but they do. And I think that's actually happening in the world geopolitically at the moment. There's this huge battle going on between globalist forces and what can be called the sovereigntist or nationalist forces. In permaculture, we wouldn't think of that as a form of relocalization, but it actually is. If the globalization trajectory has peaked, then a whole lot of things that we might be attached to about that and things we don't like about that might actually be fading. I mean, that's a big sort of uncertainty in the current world. And that sort of relocalization where more and more the circumstances locally will be more powerful rather than less in shaping what happens. Whereas we're very used to a world where, it's the same sort of economic and even social forces. It struck me when I first travelled outside of Australia to really a different country, apart from having been to New Zealand, to travel in Europe in '94 on a 6-month teaching and study tour, starting in Israel and ending in Sweden, how much the world is all the same everywhere. Despite all of the difference of geography and difference of culture, the almost the same economic forces are everywhere. And there's still elements of that unfolding, whether it's social media or AI. And in fact, the spread of permaculture itself has involved that sort of global networking. But I think understanding the deeper aspects of the start at the back doorstep, as Mollison said, or consider the self first. What is actually enlightened self-interest for me, my family or household, my kin, my community, that we can be more certain about those things close to us because we can validate reality from various different inputs and sources. As we go out to the global, everything becomes more abstract and more mediated and comes to us with all of these filters, with all sorts of agencies and powers and coalitions who all want to project a certain sense of reality. And we can be less and less certain about those things, even though having those larger view of things, the view from the mountain, stepping back, I think has always been useful. And power elites throughout history have always had that view of things, which often the parochial, illiterate village dwellers didn't have. They just had a collaborative understanding between themselves about what reality was here, but they didn't have that view from the mountain. And so I think having different ways to have the big picture is very useful. But sometimes what happens, and I think this is part of a long history in the culture of modernity, is people believe they can then, with that knowledge of whatever view they have from the top, they can grab the levers of power and pull them in some way to control the system. Well, I think that way of working has been failing for at least 50 years, perhaps longer in the modern world.
Yes.
And I suggested in the chapter on self-regulation and accepting feedback in Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability that a new mode of power had been emerging in the world in the last 50 years, where those with the big picture were gradually developing the insight that they weren't powerful enough to control the system by pulling the levers, because the system had become so complex that the system didn't respond in the way you thought it would. And you had to accept that even if you were very powerful, whoever you were or whatever you were, you couldn't actually really directly control the system, but you could poke it or tweak it or sort of do something within your own context and then see what happens next. And so that, I think, is a deeper way of understanding thinking globally but acting locally. And ironically, I think the Western American-centered empire that we've been part of since the end of the Second World War, at least, has actually been very expert at doing that. And I would see the CIA have been some of the masters at doing that and in facilitating what is benignly called regime change in many countries, recognizing all different forces and groups in society, that if you could just support this group or poke that there, and see what happens next,
Hmm.
which is very different from saying we are powerful, we can control and force the system. Now, part of my vision in permaculture is to give that form of power, that way of thinking to everyone, to be able to understand something of the big system and then say, okay, I'm just a little player. We all know we're just little players. What can we do? And is it enlightened self-interest? Does it support other circles? And yeah, maybe it radiates out in ways that we can't understand. But as we see that action happening, what do we do next? We do this or that small thing. Whereas the old idea that we develop the grand plan, we build the great coalition, we implement the plan through political and cultural means, and we climb to the top of the power mountain and we pull the levers of power in some great heroic way and save the system. I think that is a complete delusion.
Yes. Yeah.
Not just because we are not powerful enough, but it's structurally a delusion because the system is too complex and the things that get done end up actually creating other problems that may be actually worse than the original thing that was. And I think that's to some extent a lot of the thinking around the climate emergency is a lot of it is greatly in danger of falling into those sorts of responses. Sorry,
Yeah.
very,
Yeah. As you were
very
speaking,
complex answer to your question.
no, I liked it. I think it put a lot of insight into certain things, and it created an image of this Disney movie Fantasia, where Mickey Mouse is dressed up as the wizard, and he has the power to command the mops, like there's something flooding, and he's animating all these mops, and then there's an army of mops trying to slosh out buckets of water, and he can't control the army, and things are just spinning out of control. I'm imagining, humans trying to pull these levers of power and all of these unanticipated or unforeseen consequences of things that happen as a result. And then you need greater levers of power to moderate what you just did. And you get caught in this endless cycle of
Mm,
failing to control the system.
mm.
So I like this imagery, and it intersects, or it leads to a question that I had about this intersection of politics and permaculture. And would you consider permaculture a political act?
Well, I suppose some people have said that permaculture is revolution disguised as gardening. And when I met Bill Mollison in 1974, he had been at the forefront of pioneering environmental activism in Tasmania for at least 6 years. I, at the age of 19, was a second generation, come from a second generation family of political activists that my whole childhood had been involved in the ban the bomb movement and the campaign against the war in Vietnam. So we were both, I suppose, reflecting on political activism in different ways to stop the bad things happening in the world. And we were certainly motivated both by, no, we're going to just create the world we want. Firstly, by just doing it and trying to spread that through a positive cycle. Now, you could say that was sort of politically naive. A lot of people would, from a political perspective, would say, oh, permaculture is just concerned with the small things and not with the larger structural things. But it was informed by a deep understanding in very different ways, Mollison's lineage and my own, of a political understanding of the nature of the world. And yes, it hasn't been successful in transforming the world for the better. But I think in terms of the effort for results, it's been more effective than a lot of attempts to change a lot of those larger structural dynamics. I think the other thing to recognize is that although young people are often very attracted by a novel idea of that has never been tried before or never been done, the idea of something revolutionary. Most people, especially most adults and certainly older people in society are very suspicious of ideas to radically change things. And a lot of examples in history where that goes badly wrong, driven by vision and ideology. So the idea of permaculture being about just something common, ordinary, that two or more people can say, yeah, that's a good thing to do, whether it's grow a garden or, yeah, let's create a compost toilet and recycle our own waste. That focusing on simple things that are in front of people and meet some immediate need, even if it's small, avoids a lot of the big abstraction that we've got to sit down and solve the problems of the world before we can do anything. And that getting stuck in, but you've got to believe what I believe first. And I think in that sense, permaculture is not political in the same way that Mollison said it wasn't religious. It's not trying to sort of, you must understand the world through this lens, which I understand it through, and then we can do something. So even though I might be quite attached to my way of understanding the world and believe that certain ways of viewing things, that certain views from the mountain are more useful than others, it behoves us, especially at this time in history, to accept we are in a period of chaos in understanding and a breakdown in even understandings of what reality is. And that means we need to work with sometimes neighbours across the fence who maybe believe the earth is flat, not just don't believe in climate change or believe in any of our tightly held, dare I say, religious beliefs, as a lot of modern science, becomes, to, yep, there's all different ways of understanding the world, but, me swapping you some help to get your hot water system going for eggs from your chooks, yeah, we can agree on that, and that's mutually beneficial, and we see the value in each other. So, I think, yes, permaculture is political, but it's not um, going out there to say, here's the ideology, here's the program.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. That aligns with kind of how I see it, because there is something apolitical about it, like what you're saying, that yeah, it's not a domination structure, it's not coercive, it's not a way to amass power, but it is political in the sense that it kind of confronts and tries to prevent like real injustice and systematic inequality, because it tries to incorporate ethics into it. There's people care, there's fair share, there's earth care. So it tries to, inside the design system itself, make it so that it's more equitable, make it so that it's more respectful, make it so that there's more of a sense of mutual aid and solidarity built inside the system. And I think that's really important and beautiful and
Mm.
inspirational.
Yeah, well,
And
I think those values emerge naturally out of uh, system design in the same way that, so those ideas of equity and redistribution and the need that there can't be too much extremity of difference between people who depend on each other in community, between those who are the best off and those who are the least by whatever measure. There's also aspects of politics where, by following an enlightened self-interest that might be considered from the political right in conventional political thinking, uh, enlightened self-interest actually, I believe, leads people to separate part of what they're doing out of the monetary economy and back into the household and community non-monetary economy, primarily doing things for ourselves. And that is directly subversive to GDP and the dominant power of the whole political system. In some ways, it may be more subversive and threatening than the ideas of equity and redistribution of wealth between people. So we can see how ideas from what we might associate as the political left, the ideas of collectivity and equity and solidarity, and those great traditions, which is politically where my family came from, um, and those of the right of focusing on self-reliance, looking after ourselves, doing things at the smallest scale that it's viable to do, because that's better politically. That means the power lies right where the thing is done. And yes, we know some aspects of trying to do things at a very small scale. The Chinese tried backyard blast furnaces to make pig iron in the 1950s. It wasn't really good outcome, but huge number of things in society would be better if they are actually done at the smaller scale. And that does actually return power logically a huge amount to the smallest unit of societal organization, which is the household. And again, that actually is reflective of a lot of socially conservative values about family and doing things ourselves and being self-reliant, and not being dependent on the government or corporations. So you can see how threads of all sorts of different political threads can be reflected just as a organic outcome of what we do in permaculture. And that also means that as those strategies develop and have impact on society, they will receive huge pushback and resistance. So in that sense, yeah, permaculture can be truly seen as revolution disguised as gardening.
And I wanted to dig a little deeper into anarchy here and anti-authoritarian political traditions, because I know that this is a topic close to your heart. And I've been wondering, in the face of collapsing Western democracy and the rise of Trump's authoritarian regime in the US, this topic seems more important now than maybe ever before in my lifetime. And I'm wondering what it looks like to you, like uh, when you look at the situation now from an anarchistic lens or an anti-authoritarian lens, and you see what's happening. Do you have concerns? Are you optimistic? What are your thoughts on that stuff?
Yeah, I suppose I've philosophically seen myself as an anarchist, but I've never strongly emphasized that, partly because of that more than 100 years propaganda old image of the bomb throwing anarchist, which was actually a false flag operation in the late 19th century to discredit anarchism, and it's persisted right through the 20th century. So that's partly, and the way people use anarchy to mean unrestrained chaos in society leading to the worst outcomes. And then a further image of the sort of depressed poet getting up in the afternoon and sitting around in dark dives, plotting how to put a spanner in the system, uh, and being sort of pretty dysfunctional, uh, low level people in society. But I think anarchism, which can be associated with the political left, in that it emphasizes collective action, but operating that at the smallest, localist, most local scale, has its mirror on the political right in libertarian thinking, which tends to focus on, often in its articulation, on the individual, but actually hidden behind that public face within a patriarchal society was always a notion of a hidden world of the family and kin and community that operates on different rules. So rather than these things being actually really polar opposites, which is the way the normal political thinking, that actually both those lineages have something in common. So, in terms of authoritarian, I see the development of authoritarianism. If we think of that bent arrow of political left and political right being more of a circle, then the authoritarianism is actually on the opposite side of the circle, and it's both has its political left and political right forms. So in current political discourse, I can certainly see the elements of the conventional discourse that has been emerging in Europe over the last decade or so about political populists, whether in Hungary with Orban, and then more dramatically in the United States with Trump. But to me, the expressions of authoritarianism are equally strong on the so-called progressive side of politics. They have very different colours and they have very different costumes associated with them, but they are in their different ways both natural developments. In the way my future scenarios work suggested that we were moving into my brown tech future scenario, where systems of power become more desperate about being able to deal with the multiple deep structural problems that they're facing. And so they find that the democratic system, which has functioned in some sort of way while industrial modernity is delivering more and more goods to more and more people, even if it's also delivering more and more bads and disservices at the same time, because GDP is a sort of a combination of all of those things. It's just more transactions. At least there was a sense in the past that people's material well-being might be better than their parents or their grandparents. And now there's an increasing sense that one's circumstances for one's children, whatever, will be worse than the past. Now, it doesn't matter to what extent that is an accurate understanding of reality or whether it's a collective sort of change that's just based on the internal psychosocial dynamics and how much it's due to real things in the material world. And it doesn't matter how much it's due to natural forces or Machiavellian forces of evil people trying to make it that way. Those senses lead to a breakdown in trust in society's institutions and democracy, and an incredible inefficiency in trying to deal with difficult problems, and a recognition that a command economy, more like existing countries like China, is actually more efficient at getting things done. And that in that process, it's necessary to break eggs to make omelets and, sweep away millions of people to build the Three Gorges hydro dam or whatever it is, that shift to doing big things fast is the last resort of a civilization and a political system which is actually running into fundamental limits. So it's not just sort of evil people or stupid ideas that lead to this more authoritarian nature. But that doesn't mean to say, A, that it can work and even survive as a result. So I think both from a practical ecological energetics and looking at history in the past and from the philosophies of equity, it is better to build those small capacities to do things through mutual reciprocity where we don't have power over our neighbour to get them to do something, but we can see the common interest in doing those things for mutual benefit. Those things are no absolute insurance against the either collective madness or the divide and rule politics and all of those things. But I think understanding that crises often do bring out the best in human behavior and the ability to focus on what is the right thing to do. So there's a lot of evidence on that too. So the idea that as conditions get worse and resources get worse, people inevitably start destroying each other. This story of a dog eat dog world. Well, the irony is that shows complete ignorance of dog ecology and psychology, because when food is abundant, dogs fight each other for it. When food is scarce, they hunt in a pack collectively for mutual benefit. So, yeah, well, okay, maybe it's wrong to use dogs or chooks or other animals as a model or analogy of society, but it just shows that that idea is not even founded on observed reality. That difficult circumstances do as much to create cooperative structures. I'll give you another example. The difference between Australia and some other continents, in fact, North America, the evidence is that Australia had virtually nothing that we would call warfare between tribes. Yes, there was conflicts and whatever, but there's no archaeological evidence or cultural evidence of actually organized warfare. I believe that's because the resource base was so poor that it's not worth going to war with the neighbouring tribe to sort of capture their territory, because you use more resources than you gain.
Hmm.
Whereas warfare that did exist in places of greater resource abundance occasionally then became supercharged in the Middle East with the development of agriculture, because it became actually energetically worthwhile to actually go and capture neighbouring territory, take over that, and enlarge your tribe. And so at that time, in the last 5 to 10,000 years, the development of these ancestral patterns of limited warfare that existed in many tribal societies, even in those societies where warfare existed, like the New Guinea Highlands, for example, warfare was quite common between tribes, but it still was mostly about just sorting out young men internally. It wasn't about how do we go over and build an empire by raping and pillaging and capturing the other people. But once agriculture develops resource base, specialization, standing armies, that genie came out of the bottle, this sort of ancient pattern of limited warfare, to become so problematic. And you look at the 20th century, the century of incredible resource abundance, so much vaster than anything before. And it's a century of great and deadly warfare. So I think some of those patterns, they don't mean that we're facing a benign future without conflict, or that efforts at utopian political systems, be they libertarian or anarchistic, be they aided by permaculture design or other ideas, are sort of just destined to just fall into place in some sort of benign way at all. I think we're facing enormous challenges, but this deep idea that when resources are scarce, humans will just attack and tear each other to pieces, I think is just historically wrong and energetically wrong.
Yeah, that idea of it being unfounded is a little bit reassuring, because if you're correct and we are facing an energy descent where we will face more and more resource scarcity and maybe more material poverty, then this could perhaps facilitate greater collaboration and cooperation in some places. So that gives me a little silver lining to think about that. So thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
for that.
which is
And
difficult
and
when we look at the world around us. To and I think we can't be sort of it can't turn into rose-colored glasses, but because those things could take maybe generations for humans to work out that again, to learn that, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, that's a thing. As you were speaking, that this was a question that came to me. So I'm glad you said this to trigger it to come back. Uh, Maybe you have some ideas on the psychological or emotional shifts that would be required to prepare us for a future with less energy or less resources. Do you have a sense of what some of those could be?
Well, that's why gardening and farming were one of the reasons why that was so central in permaculture from the beginning, because especially gardening is, apart from it being the most sustainable form of agriculture that we know on the planet, that can be in all different forms practiced everywhere, and is basically part of rebuilding household and community non-monetary economies, because that's what it largely is, and provides for immediate needs. It develops this basic understanding of the cycles of life and the limits that nature sets, that have become completely abstracted as we've lived in the technospheric bubble. So it brings us back down to earth in that sense of, oh, yeah, you can't guarantee that you get tomatoes even every year, let alone a kilo of tomatoes every week through the year. Oh, nature doesn't work like that. Things come in pulses and flows, and they're irregular and erratic. And being able to go with the flow, all of those things are necessary, not just at a practical level, in that overall people will be closer to their sources of sustenance in a lower energy future out of necessity, but because it starts to build a mindset or a mentality that can see ways of not just survival, but ways of thriving within a world of less. That, we can see that being a shift from quantity to quality, from valuing the gift of nature and its uncertainties. The first tomatoes of the season are special because they are the first, rather than the system which has provided them all of the year round from global logistics. So there's so many other things that we gain that become gifts from ordinary processes, and similarly those in the cultural realm of unmediated storytelling, of music and simple arts that don't require huge and extravagant resources, that don't require permission of political or economic gatekeepers to allow us to do something. All of those things of, where will we still have power and autonomy, even if we lose, the right and the ability to just say, oh, I just want to get on a plane and go somewhere, or visit my relatives on the other side of the world. Oh no, I can't do that. All of these sense in the world of how we might be constrained. Oh, we don't have access to that high-tech medical intervention. Okay, so where are the things that are not necessarily the direct substitutes for those things, in a, that, like in a simple view of organic farming? Oh, you get the organic pesticide instead of the chemical pesticide. That that there's other ways of being in the world, and a sense of thriving, that don't require all of those systems. And if that is done ahead of needing that, especially in a multi-generational sense, then that's actually a benign energy descent. And in the extreme, as the saying goes, collapse now, avoid the rush.
Hmm.
um, we have experienced some of that in sort of minor hiccups when the COVID kerfuffle, or pandemic, or COVID and its discontents, whatever it was, it didn't actually really affect us materially because just the way we live had already assumed a home-based lifestyle. We already had, you know, food supplies. We don't depend on that just-in-time world. And you could say, yes, we've suffered all sorts of, you could say, economic disadvantage from not taking advantage of all those things, in the same way that I haven't spent time flying around the world, you know, giving lectures and having the biggest maximum impact that I can have. But there's been ways where, ironically, even the technology we're using here has come along and rewarded that, at least temporarily, that staying at home behavior, if you like. So, you know, I think there's many different ways in which permaculture can lead people to adaptive and graceful energy descent. But we can see from even simple interruptions to things, the most extreme, dysfunctional, hilarious one that I remember from COVID was the panic over toilet paper. Well,
Hmm.
toilet paper is not a necessity of life. It's, you know,
You
like,
got to get a bidet.
yeah, or whatever, or a leaf, or some old newspaper. You know, like, you know, toughen up. You know, and yet things like that failing in the modern world could create real psychosocial emergencies, and also a preparedness of people to sacrifice their freedom for being saved in the straitjacket of authoritarian power that promises to look after them, promises
Mm-hmm.
to provide their comforts. And those apparently hilarious, ridiculous, you know, failures for uh, privileged, affluent people, which is very different from people who are literally living hand to mouth, you know, earning the dollars today that will be tomorrow's food, and that there's, in countries where there's no social support system, and for some of those people who even no family support system. So there are huge vulnerabilities in the world where people are on this mouse wheel of constant possibilities. And I think that's one of the things that permaculture in different parts of the world ends up being quite different, because of those circumstances are very different for different people.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as we draw to a close here, I want to respect your time. I know we're about up. There was one question that I wanted to end with, which was if you had to, because we've spoken a lot about the good things about permaculture,
Mm,
and if you could maybe name the thing that jumps out to your mind first, if you had to name one dark side of permaculture or one way that it could be harmful,
mm.
does anything come to mind?
Ah, well, in the piece I wrote in the book Permaculture Pioneers, stories of 23 different pioneers of permaculture. And in my story, I had a dread in the early days of permaculture turning into some sort of eco-fascism, in a
Mm,
radically changing world. And I can't see any signs that that has happened, but I could see how that potential was there if the world had unraveled as fast into energy descent as we thought it would in the 1980s, where ideas like permaculture would be thrust into the foreground, and then with various risks of charismatic leadership. And certainly Bill Mollison had that element to him, although he denied being the guru. You know, there was that element, and the idea of populist solutions. Here we have all these solutions, and then those being rolled out in some sort of structure, I saw that could easily lead to very large scale disasters. I think the problems, the dark side of permaculture has been much more modest, maybe partly because it hasn't managed to generate a power base at a large enough scale. But the biggest one, I suppose, would be the incipient tendency in all movements to develop ideological rigidity and to push certain fixed solutions. And, I've been on the record for questioning some of those popularized permaculture strategies, even at land management scale, whether swales are appropriate everywhere as an earth water retaining technology, or ideas where we can see the over enthusiastic promotion of something is diminishing other sources of kindred ideas. So that idea that, the ideas are coming from within permaculture and not enough in some ways to, there's these other kindred ideas that when we look at from a permaculture lens, that a lot reflects permaculture principles. But we need to respect also that those people came to those lineages through completely different ways. Now, a common example of that, of course, is various forms of traditional and indigenous knowledge, but it applies to many, many different ordinary things in society. So that tendency to arrogance, tendency to we have the answers. I think overall, in terms of as I see the movement globally, those things have been not particularly problematic and have been smaller. But sometimes the over promotion of something can lead to good ideas society being inoculated against them because of too much of an over promotion of them.
Hmm.
So moving into the populist phase before the experimental innovation proof level had developed more. But over the years, I've become more sanguine about those downsides. Whereas, ironically, in my youth, as I saw Mollison spread permaculture to the world, I saw a lot of those warning signs, and I was at the time, quite critical of some of those things. But of course, all ideas when they go out into the world get dirty in the real world. And permaculture got a bit dirty through that rapid initial popularization and that evangelism. But we can look at ideas like sustainable development came out of academia and went straight into global politics and got very dirty very quickly.
Hmm.
So, in some senses, this is just, ideas and ideals running up against realities and human fallibilities.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I think that's an important takeaway and a thing that people should be aware of and realize is a consideration when we are expressing ideas or we're trying to implement change or do something good. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, thank you for that. And I would just like to give the floor to you here towards the end to just talk about anything that you might have going on, coming up, something you might
Yeah.
like people to check out.
Well, I think there's two things that I would mention in terms of resources that are both actually available free. One is a film by permaculture colleague Dan Palmer. It's called Reading Landscape with David Holmgren, and it's about the passion in that subject of being central to permaculture. It's available to view the film online and at readinglandscape.org. And the other one is at Holmgren Design, holmgren.com.au. In the writings page, there's a lot of my writings, both recent and going back further, including about some of the big picture subjects that we've talked about, as well as things more practical. But the latest series is being published progressively each 2 weeks, tracing the last 50 years. It's called Permaculture 50 Years Weathering Climate Change. So it's my journey with weather, with climate, with all of the ideas in permaculture of microclimate design, and this big looming question that hangs over the world and our thinking about climate change. So they're things that I'm been working on recently or am currently working on that may be of interest to your listeners.
Thank you, David. I will put links to that stuff in the show notes so people can go find it there and check it out. And I just want to thank you for your time today. It was great being able to speak with you. I'm very grateful for your existence as a person, for all of your contributions to permaculture, all of your thinking, your writing, your presence, your kindness. So I'm very grateful for spending some time with you today. So thank you for passing through with me.
Great to talk to you, Danny.
Thank you for passing through today. Yeah, you, dear listener. Thank you for your support, for your attention, for spending some time with me and this episode's guest. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe, rate it, like it, tell your friends about it, buy a billboard somewhere next to a highway promoting it. I mean, I'm kidding, of course, but your support really does mean a lot to me. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next time.